which just came out in April. And I've made this recipe in the past with just the cheese, but this time including the chorizo as well, since it's even more delicious made all together. So if you do have the book out in front of you, you're gonna want to open it up to page 30, because we're gonna start with the queso quesadilla. And I'm putting that here, getting ready for that. And as we get started, just a couple of logistical things. If you are new to the Todo Verde online cooking classes space, you're always welcome to ask any questions throughout the class. This is meant to be interactive. You can always unmute yourself, ask the question that you have, comment, and then make sure to mute yourself once again so that we don't have any background noise throughout the class. You can always enter your questions in the chat box, and Sarah here from Todo Verde will be reading off those questions or concerns or anything like that. And then another thing that I just like to mention is I'm based here in Los Angeles. I've been working with Todo Verde. I started about 5 years ago now, and mostly because I wanted to create these plant-based dishes that felt like my family dishes, just missing the meat, dairy, and all those things, right? And so I'm so honored to be able to share these recipes with you in this class, but also in form of the cookbook, which is La Vida Verde. So let's get right into it, because we do have a couple of recipes and it's going to take some time. And so the first thing I want to do is make the queso quesadilla. And the main ingredient, well, there's a few main ingredients here, but I'll go over the ingredients one by one, the reasons I use them, and then we'll start to play with them and combine them together. And if at any point I lose sound or anything, we've had a few issues here and there, just let me know if you need me to adjust the camera or anything like that. So the first ingredient here that we're going to be playing with is cashews. So I have raw cashew pieces that have just been soaking in room temp water for about an hour or so. I am using a Vitamix blender, which is a high power blender. So even if I soak them for 30 minutes in warm water, they'll be rehydrated enough and soft enough to be able to blend them pretty smooth and creamy. If you have a home blender, just make sure that you soak them for at least a couple hours or perhaps overnight. And so this is half a cup of raw cashew pieces. I like to use raw cashews. Sorry, there's a fire truck going by. It gets pretty loud. Okay, so I like to use raw cashews here because the toasted cashews obviously already have a certain flavor element to them, and I want to make sure that the cashews here serve as more of a neutral flavor profile and just provide some creaminess. And I'm using pieces because they're cheaper to purchase than getting the whole fancy cashews. So I'm going to drain this water out and I'll end up adding it to a blender. The other ingredient here that I'll be playing with is some coconut oil, and it's really important here. I need to melt mine a little bit more, so as I'm prepping the other ingredients, it'll melt on the stove with it. But really important here is that it has to be refined coconut oil, which means that it doesn't have a coconut flavor. So if you use virgin coconut, your cheese is going to taste like coconut, which you don't want. But if you use the refined coconut oil, it's going to be, this provides the fat texture, but it doesn't provide a flavor of coconut. And it keeps solidifying on me. Today's a little bit chilly here in Los Angeles, so it's not as loose as it typically could be. And then, so that's 1/3 of a cup of the refined coconut oil. And then I have here a 1/4 cup of tapioca flour, which is really important in this dish. I'll let you know exactly when you start to see it activated in this dish when it hits the heat. But this will provide a little bit of that stretch in the cheese. So the cashews are more of the smooth texture, coconut oil is the fat. This is also a little bit of that stringy pool texture. I'm also going to add a little bit of water in the cheese, and I have here 1/2 cup of water. And the recipe calls for 1.5 cups. I'll show you the other cup is already inside of my small pot that I'm going to use to melt down my agar. And then I have a tablespoon of nutritional yeast, which is this powdery, flaky yumminess that you see in most cheeses that are plant-based. And so this is another main ingredient that's more of a flavoring of the cheese. And I also am going to add some probiotic capsules, which I'll show you in a moment when I add those towards the end of this dish. I want to talk a little bit about my agar, and there's a couple different agars that you can use for this dish. I mean, there's a lot of varieties. You can get agar in flakes and powder and bricks and these noodle shapes, so many different ways that you can get agar. I typically use either the flakes or the fine powder. And just note that if you're using the flaky agar, which is very, very light and airy, you're using 2.5 tablespoons of the flakes. But if you're using this fine powder agar, which is almost a difference between like a kosher salt, which is, you know, similar to the flakes, but obviously the flakes are a lot lighter here, or using like this really fine table salt. This is a little bit more dense. It's more potent. And so here you would only want to use 1 3/4 teaspoons, so much less of it if you're using this fine agar, which is what I'm going to be using today. So the other cup that I have of water for this recipe is already in my pot. And so I'm going to see if I can space you in here. So I have here a pot of water. It's just 1 cup of water. And I'm going to add here my agar. Really important to note is that you should have your stove off. So this water should not be warm at all when you add the agar, because as soon as it starts to get heated up, it activates right away. So because I'm using the fine agar, I'm going to use the 1 3/4 teaspoons, which I'm going to put in before I turn on the stove. So I just like to get all my spoons ready. So I have 1 1/2 1/4, so that's 1 3/4 teaspoons. And I'm just going to open this up, and it can get a little messy because this powder is all over the place. There we go. And another thing to note is you want to make sure that your measuring is leveled off so that it's not heaping over the top or anything like that, because then you'll have too much of the agar. And with this fine powder, a little goes a long way. So there's my 1 3/4 teaspoon. And I'll put this away. And let me show you what that looks like for a moment. You can see that it's just there in the center. It needs to get mixed in. If I were to have this water already be hot, what would happen is it would just start to gel and melt into itself. But I want to make sure that it's distributed into the water, which that's all it takes. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn on my heat. And if you were using the flakes, one thing that you would note with the flakes is that you can see them a lot more in the pot. Whereas with this powder, obviously, I mean, you can see as I move my whisk around, you can kind of see some of it moving in there. And so what I want to do is cook this at a medium temperature, constantly whisking, and I want this to come to a bubble. And so what you'll see is that you'll see this powder that's in here that will dissolve into the water, and the water will also start to look thicker and will start to look like a gel. And that's what you want. This is a vegan gelatin, and this is what's gonna help you mold the cheese into a cheese so that you can slice it later. So I just turned on the heat. It's gonna take a few moments for it to start to get hot. And right next to my stove here, I have my coconut oil that needs to melt down a little bit, which is fine because even if this is gonna go in the blender, it's fine if it still has a little bit of texture. The blender will help break it down. And then I had my tofu for my chorizo in the freezer, and it's still kind of thawing out, so I have it here as well. I put it in the freezer for 2 reasons. It's been hard to find tofu in my local store, so I bought one a while ago, and I popped it in the freezer so I can pull it out when I need to. But also, freezing your tofu, this is sort of a side note here, freezing your tofu and then letting it thaw out will allow more of the liquid to drain out of the tofu, which is what you want. You want as much of that liquid out as possible. So there's still just a few chunks, and by the time we get done with this cheese, I'll likely be able to crumble that into smaller pieces. So you can see I'm already getting a little bit of simmering happening here. And I'm just gonna make sure that I'm whisking and that I'm making sure that it's not sticking, which it shouldn't really stick. But the main thing is that I'm moving it along. And I'm actually gonna lower my heat slightly. My stove sometimes gets a little too hot. So I just want this slow simmer. And I could already start to see that the water is starting to look a little bit more textured, a little bit thicker. And so while this is going, while I'm keeping my eye on this, I just want to quickly blend the other ingredients. So I'm going to grab my blender cup here. And I'm going to, let me put this aside. I'm going to grab my spatula. Let's get that ready. My coconut oil is not going to have too much more time to hang out here to kind of melt a little bit. So I'm going to grab my cashews that I had earlier, and I'm going to drain all this water out.
Jocelyn, quick question. When you're using agar flakes, do you allow them to hydrate or bloom before starting to heat?
I do the same exact thing that I did here. So I would add it to the water before the heat is on, and I would do the exact same steps. I wouldn't say that they bloom. It's like gelatin, so it'll just dissolve. It's not gonna like puff up or do anything other than dissolve into the liquid. So I'm multitasking here, but to try to get a little bit of a head start. But what we would have done, or what you could have do at home, is blend the stuff in the blender first before you start playing with the agar. But I'm trying to do two things at once. I'm gonna put in my coconut oil into the blender. I'm getting every little last bit of it out here. And then I'm going to grab my tapioca flour, which is 1/4 cup of tapioca flour, and just drop that in there. Let me just use my spatula again. Grab every little last bit. And then I have my 1/2 cup of water that I'm gonna just drop right into the blender. My tablespoon of nutritional yeast. And some salt. And I want this to be fairly salty. So I'm gonna add quite a few pinches of this pink Himalayan salt, which isn't very salty. This recipe is salt to taste. So if you have a fine table salt, you'll likely use less than I will. If you have a flaky kosher, you'll use a little bit less as well, because those are a little bit more salty than this pink Himalayan. And remember that cheese is salty. So you wanna make sure to add enough salt to make sure that you give it that nice salty kick that cheese provides to most dishes. And I'll drop my lid on here. I'm using a Vitamix, so it has this awesome tamper that I can use to push anything down. And let me just blend this until smooth. All right, and so the texture that I'm looking for here is nice and smooth and creamy. The cashews have all broken down. It's a little bit of a loose sauce, which will obviously thicken up. There's tapioca flour in here, so that's gonna help it thicken up. And let's come back to this agar. I'm gonna slightly turn up the heat again. I had it on kind of this low heat, so it's like barely simmering, just helping it move along as I worked on the other stuff. So there we go. I wanna make sure that I keep mixing this through. Again, you can see that it's slightly thickened up. So just notice the texture of this water and how much thicker it is as I move it along. You can see that it's definitely thickened up. I want it to thicken up just a little bit more. So I'm just gonna keep moving it along here. I'm gonna turn up the heat just a touch more.
Jocelyn, for this recipe, could you use another neutral oil instead of a coconut oil?
You want to use coconut oil because when you put coconut oil in the refrigerator, it solidifies, whereas another oil, like for example, olive oil, which also has a strong flavor, which I wouldn't use because then you'd have a cheese that tastes like olive oil, it won't solidify in the fridge. And so if you want to create a cheese like this, that has that texture, you need to use a coconut oil. So notice how much this is thickening up. It's kind of an opaque gel now. It definitely doesn't look like water anymore. This is almost there. I'm just going to give this about another 30 seconds or so. And I'm just making sure that I'm whisking thoroughly so that there's nothing that's getting stuck on the bottom, there's no burning happening, and that it's cooking evenly. And so this agar is actually a really awesome ingredient if you haven't worked with it before. I mean, it's very similar to any gelatin. Like growing up, you may have made Jello like I did with those Jello packs, which had gelatin in them. I mean, it's a very similar process in that you need to just melt the gelatin until it's completely smooth into the liquid. You can use this to do something similar like that to make a Jello. All right, so I'm gonna really lower the heat here because I'm gonna take a few moments to use my spatula and take everything out of the blender. And I don't want, since this is already thickening up, I wanna make sure that it doesn't burn while I'm working on getting everything out of the blender. Let me do that one more time. There we go. Okay, so just notice here, it's like a very opaque, kind of thick. It's a little bit runny right now because it's hot. But if this were to get popped in the fridge right now, it would turn into Jello. So this is the consistency that you're looking for. Note that it's kind of coating the bottom of my pot. That's what you want. And so I'm going to set you down for a moment so I can use both hands. And all I'm gonna do, it's on very low heat. I'm gonna just use my spatula to scrape everything off of this camper because I want every little last bit of this cheese in here. And put this in the sink, and then I'm going to pour all the contents into the pot. So it's all gonna go in here together. And from this point forward, I'm gonna just use my spatula. And one more thing I'll do right now is I'll also, once I scrape mostly everything out of here, I'm gonna give it a taste for salt. Because you could already give it a taste and see, okay, and it still needs a bit more of a touch of salt, and add it now before it really starts to meld together as a cheese. All right, I think I got most of it out of here. There we go. There we go. All of it for the most part. Okay. Let me give that a little tiny taste. I'm just gonna put it on the back of my hand. That's nice and salty. So no more salt needed. So you can see here, notice how you see all the agar there on the side, and the cheese hasn't really mixed in. I'm gonna slightly turn up my heat now that I'm paying attention to it again, and we'll be mixing it all together. And so I want to bring all the mixture together, and you'll start to see that the cheese mixture that we just mixed in is gonna start to curd up a little bit before it really melts in. And you'll start to see the tapioca activating. I could already see the tapioca activating. Let me put this even a little bit lower. And so this you don't want to walk away from. You really want to keep your eye on it. You want to keep it moving. Notice how it's already thickening up. That's what you're seeing there is the tapioca flour being activated by the heat. And I'm gonna keep cooking this until it forms like a loose dough. So I'm just gonna keep working this, making sure I'm getting everything from the edges, making sure that I'm scraping off as much as possible from the bottom. And this will take a few minutes to get there, not too long. You can already see that it's starting to form a little bit of that dough, where it's kind of coming into itself a little bit, kind of sticking to itself. It's kind of smooth. It's almost there, just another maybe minute. I'm gonna lower the heat a little bit more because I just want this to come together, but I don't want it to start to sear. That's for later when we're making our quesadillas. And so notice that it's really starting to form a little loose ball of dough. This is what you're looking for. Oh my goodness, and it's so funny using one hand. I usually have my other hand on the handle so the pot's not moving all over the place. But whatever works. Okay. Just making sure you can see everything okay. Let me lower that slightly. All right, so at this point, this is the consistency that I'm looking for. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the heat. So the heat is off, but even though the heat is off, I'm still gonna keep moving this for another moment, just to let the pot slightly cool down, just for a moment. I'm gonna try to scrape off as much off the bottom of my pot here as possible. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my probiotics, and I'll talk about the probiotics for a moment before we add them in. So let me grab those from the fridge, which is where I typically store them. And they're usually in the door, but they're not. Let me check back here. There we go. All right, so a couple of probiotics. This is acidophilus, which is what I typically use for this recipe. It's sort of a mild probiotic. And what this allows your cheese to do is to ferment. So there's live cultures in here, and this is what provides a little bit of that tangy flavor that you would have in a cheese. And I also sometimes use this Gyrodophilus, which is a little bit more strong in terms of the probiotic. So it ferments a little bit more than the acidophilus, but for this recipe, acidophilus is perfectly fine. So I'm gonna add 2 to 3 capsules. And you wanna make sure that they're the capsules and not tablets, because what you're gonna do is you're gonna put the powder from the capsules into the cheese mixture, and you're gonna toss the capsule. So you're only using the powder that's inside. If you had tablets, likely they're not really live cultures. So you wanna make sure to use the capsules. And so what I'm gonna do is, don't toss it right in there like I just did. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to open up a capsule and just toss the content of the capsule into my cheese. And I'm gonna do that for all three. I'm gonna use 3 right now. Make sure every little last bit comes out. And once you put this in here, you want to just let this go into a mold, which we'll do in a moment. And then you want to let it sit on your counter for 15, 18 hours to let it ferment, let it really do its thing. And what's important is my heat is off. It's been off for maybe a minute or so. You don't want to cook the probiotic capsules into your cheese because you'll kill the cultures. So you want to make sure that it's already, the heat is off. All right, so I'm just folding this in to my cheese, making sure that it's all mixed in. And I have here just a bowl that I'm going to use to mold my cheese, and I just have a little bit of plastic wrap that it's lined with. The reason I use, just a food grade plastic wrap is to be able to easily pull the cheese out of the bowl later. And then just to cover it. So when it's in the fridge, it has something to kind of just cover it. And so I'm just making sure that the plastic wrap is molded into the bowl. And I'm just gonna pour my cheese content into this bowl. And it's just gonna go right in there. You can see a little bit of that stretch and pull from the tapioca flour. You get every little last bit of it in here. There we go. And so I'm just going to use my plastic wrap to press it down. So I'm going to fold it over and just press it down so that it creates sort of this flat bottom, because right now it was a little bit of a mound. But then the important thing is that once you do that, open it again, because this cheese with the probiotics is going to need to breathe. If it doesn't have access to air, it's not going to really ferment very well. So you want to be able to leave it open, or you could cover it with another piece of plastic wrap and just pull coals over the top. That would work out well too. So that cheese will sit on the counter for 15 to 18 hours, and then you'll pop it in the fridge for a couple hours, and you should have a nice molded cheese. So that's our cheese recipe for now. Any questions? As I transition to the next recipe. Okay, so let me get started on this next recipe. Let me put my probiotics back in the fridge.
We do have one question. Can you loosely cover the cheese with parchment paper?
Yeah, you can use parchment paper, definitely, and just make sure that it still has access to air so that it can breathe. And let me grab another pan here. All right, great. So I have 2 skillets. I have a cast iron, and I have just a stainless steel. And I'm gonna turn the heat on here to just a low heat, just so that it starts to warm up for both of them as I start to talk about the ingredients for the quesadillas, for the chorizo. So I am going to turn my pages here to get to the chorizo recipe, which is on page 75. And you can see here that it's a nice crumbly chorizo that's using tempeh, mushrooms, and tofu to create that texture. And the sauce or the marinade that we're going to make is very similar to any chorizo that you would have that has like a pork or beef in it. So let's get started with I'm going to let the tofu hang out near the stove for a little while longer, but I have 2 cups of tofu that is just going to be completely crumbled into little pieces, almost like you're making a tofu scramble. And so we can just set that aside, make sure that it's nice and squeeze dry as much as possible. Again, you can use the freezer method where you pop it in the freezer. Ideally, you would open up the container, drain all the liquid out, then put the tofu block into the freezer, and then let that thaw out and drain on some paper towels or a towel, and then try to squeeze out any of the excess liquid. A lot more liquid will come out rather than using just a fresh piece of tofu. Is just another trick. And then I have some chiles, which are really important to this dish. I have some guajillos, and I have some chile de árbol, and I have some chile ancho. So let me talk about the different chiles if you're not super familiar with chiles. The chile ancho is exactly that. It means wide. So it's kind of a wider chile, as you can see here. And it's typically a dried pasilla that's, you know, not a pasilla, sorry, a poblano. It's typically a dried poblano, which is a wide green chile that has like broad shoulders. And so this recipe calls for 3 because these were kind of little. I threw in a 4th small one, but 3 ancho chiles, 3 guajillo chiles, and I have 2 that are extremely long, and then 1 that's a little bit smaller, so kind of evening that out. But guajillos are another dried chile that obviously look a lot different. They're long, narrow, have a pointy end to them. And one thing to note with your anchos and your guajillos, even though they're dry, they should have a little bit of flexibility to them. They should be a bit pliable. That's how you know that they're fresh dried chiles. If they are really crunchy and crispy, they've likely been dried for a long period of time, so they're not super fresh, which is fine. You can still use them. They might just need to rehydrate a bit longer, but fresh dried chiles are ideal. And then I have 2 chile de árbol, which are really spicy. They're a lot smaller, but have a similar shape to the guajillo, so like a mini form of them, but definitely a lot spicier. And what I did with all these chiles is I took the stems off, I opened them up, and I took all the seeds out, and then I gave them a rinse. And I'm going to just pan roast these in a dry skillet, which I have preheating here next to me. And I'm going to turn up the heat slightly since I'm going to get to that point in a moment. And all I want to do is create a little bit of searing on the chiles. I don't want them to completely blacken because that creates bitterness. But I do want a little bit of coloring, a little bit of blackness on this, but not until the point where they're super burnt to a crisp. And the chile de árbol will cook a lot faster. So I'll likely pull those out of the pan before the other chiles. And I have a bowl of water just next to the stove. And so once these chiles are seared, I'm going to end up putting them into that bowl of water to rehydrate, which is really important because you want them to completely rehydrate into the water so that they become really soft and super pliable again, and you can use them to blend into a sauce. And then the water that we end up using to rehydrate them, you want to keep it. So it's going to be flavored with the chiles that are rehydrating, and you're going to use half a cup of that water to blend the chiles and all the other spices into a paste. And then the other thing we'll be using here, other things, I have a series of spices here, if I can just lower this. So I have quite a few spices here, starting with a tablespoon of dried Mexican oregano. I think it's easier if I do that. Tablespoon of dried Mexican oregano. And I have 2 tablespoons of paprika. which are going to give it a nice color, a nice depth of flavor and smokiness. I have 3 cloves, and I have a teaspoon of ground cumin, which is here. And if you didn't have ground cumin, you could use whole cumin seeds, but ground is easier. And then I have a half teaspoon of ground coriander. And I also have about a half teaspoon or so of Mexican cinnamon. I didn't have it in powder form, so I'm just using a piece of a stick of cinnamon. And all these ingredients are all going to get toasted in the same skillet that I use to toast the chiles. And that is going to wake up all of these spices and make them super fragrant, super aromatic. And that's going to be a big part of the flavor of our chorizo. So let's get into that in a moment. And then the last thing that I'll show you here is I just have a tablespoon of liquid aminos and a tablespoon of vinegar that I already just put together just to not use so many bowls. But I'm using apple cider vinegar, and I have liquid aminos, and I will be using a little bit of oil to sear off the mushrooms, the tempeh, the tofu, about a half a cup throughout the recipe, maybe more as needed. Salt and pepper to taste. I did already grind a little bit of black pepper into this bowl here with the spices, and I'll be adding some of my salt to taste as I go along. And the last couple ingredients here that I'll just quickly talk about are, and I can feel the heat here. Let me lower it a little bit. I have my mushrooms and my tempeh. So I have here 8 ounces of cremini mushrooms. You can use portobello if you don't have cremini on hand. White button you could use, although the flavor is not as umami as a cremini or other types of mushrooms. And I just put them in a food processor to break them down. You could mince them with a knife, but the food processor breaks them down to a point where I really like this texture in the chorizo. And then I have here a cup of tempeh, which is about a container of tempeh. I just crumbled it up, and as I cook it, I'll break it down a little bit more even with the back of a spoon. And the last thing I'll mention is I have here mushroom powder. I'm going to use a teaspoon of mushroom powder. This is dried porcini powder. If you have other mushroom powder on hand, you can definitely use that. I've seen dried shiitake, different mushroom varieties. But this is also just going to create a little bit of depth of flavor in this dish. If you didn't have the mushroom powder, it's totally fine, but I just like that it gives a little bit of extra flavor to this dish. So let me go ahead and bring you over to the stove, and let's get cooking. All right, so I have my 2 skillets here, the stainless steel and the cast iron. They're both pretty hot. I can feel with my hand that they're both pretty hot. And I'm going to start off with my chiles here in the stainless steel. I'm not going to add any oil to it at this point. The oil will mostly focus on just the tofu, the tempeh, and the mushrooms. And so I'm just setting them down one side first. Let me put the chile de árbol may make you cough because of the smoke that's going to come out. You want to try to kind of cook them enough to blacken, but to try to catch them before they really start smoking. And I have here in this bowl some water. And so it's just a bowl of water. And once these are seared, I'll just toss them in that bowl of water. And so let me turn up the heat slightly here. It's harder to see the blackening happening on the chile ancho because they're already dark. You can see a little bit of that heat. It's already kind of steaming. But it's a little bit more difficult to see. You can see it a little bit more if they were to be seared in oil because they'll start to bubble up a little bit. And this will just take a couple minutes, about a minute or so per side. Like I said, the chile de árbol might go a little bit faster, so I'll keep my eye on it. And this is also something that you don't want to walk away from. You want to hang out. It's pretty quick to cook chiles. They could easily burn and stiffen up, and everyone in your home will be coughing like crazy. So that's just one of the funny things about chiles. There's like a fine line to cooking them and releasing the oils, and essentially what all this toasting is doing for the chiles and all the other spices is reactivating the flavors. It's just letting them know, hey, wake up. I know you've been dried out and sleeping for a while, but I want to use you and make sure you're nice and delicious. And so notice here that blackening happening with my chile de árbol. So I'm going to turn those slightly. You just want to keep an eye on all this. I'm going to start turning these. And I'm at about a medium heat. You can see a little bit of that searing happening, which is sort of that browning that's happening in this area. That's happening from searing it right now. And they're definitely becoming fragrant, that's for sure. And so notice here a little bit of that blackening happening. That's exactly what you want. You just don't want the whole chile to get black and charred, and they also get crispy when they're burnt too. You don't want that. So this will just take less than a minute to finish these up. And I'm going to use the same saute pan to cook my spices, and then I'll toss in my mushrooms and my tempeh. Notice that. So that's what I'm looking for, that searing that's happening there. Almost done. You notice this chile there. And if these were being cooked in oil, it would also go a lot faster because the oil brings the temperature so much higher. And so they just pan fry a lot faster. So I'm gonna start to toss in my chile de árbol. These are ready to go. I'm gonna give my guajillos and my anchos just another moment. This one I will toss in. It has browned quite a bit. So go ahead and toss that in the liquid. And I can start to see a little bit of the smokiness coming out of this. So just a few more seconds and then we're good to go on these chiles. So you can see it's pretty quick, and this would make, you know, any really good sauce if you were just cooking, you know, tofu or mushrooms or tempeh or like so many other things. You can actually just, you know, shred some oyster mushrooms, saute them, and make a sauce with anchos and guajillos and make a really, really delicious chile rojo that you can cook those in. All right, so these are good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and drop them in my water. And I'm gonna make sure that they're really pushed into the water. I'm actually gonna leave my tongs just sitting on top of them here so that they stay submerged. Let's see. Making sure. And you can also add another bowl on top of them to make sure that they're fully submerged. And so this skillet is still hot. I'm going to need to clean off that spatula, but I'm just gonna toss it here and you can see that they're quickly cooking, smoking. This takes just a moment. They're about to burn. Let me go ahead and toss them into my blender. All right. Wow, that was too hot. So I'm gonna go ahead and toss all of these spices into the blender. That cooked really quickly. So it should take a little bit longer than that. So I lowered it to low heat, but you just wanna cook them enough until they get slightly smoky. You saw that they were really smoky. And and until they become fragrant and aromatic. So I can smell all those different spices in there. I might actually, no, I'm good. I'm definitely good because these are gonna keep cooking while they are inside of the sauce that's gonna be cooked here with the mushrooms, the tempeh, and the tofu. So I'm gonna add half of my oil here. This pan really got hot. And I'm going to toss in my mushrooms and my tempeh into this pan. And the heat is all the way to low right now too. So it just got really hot with the chiles there. And I want to make sure to season this well with some salt. And again, I'm using this pink Himalayan salt, which isn't very salty. So I want to make sure it has a nice kick to it. And I'm going to add my teaspoon of mushroom powder. So I'm just eyeballing about a teaspoon. I'm going to turn my heat up now that that's dropping the temperature of this saute pan. And essentially what I want to do is I want to cook these mushrooms and tempeh until they're crispy, until they definitely have some color on them. And with mushrooms, you definitely want the heat to be a little bit high. So I'm turning up my heat again. And I'm just using the back of my spatula to break down any little last bits of tempeh that might be kind of large, because I want to have sort of a smaller texture in my chorizo. So let me cook that for a few moments. I have my spices that are all in here. You can see are toasted up. And I'm just gonna add in here my tablespoon of apple cider vinegar and my tablespoon of liquid aminos. If you didn't have liquid aminos, you can always add soy sauce. And I'm waiting for my chiles to rehydrate. Ooh, those spices are like super fragrant, super aromatic. So once my chiles have rehydrated for at least about 10 minutes or so, I'll go ahead and add them to the blender with a half a cup of water. And I'll blend this until it's a smooth paste. In the meantime, we're all about cooking this tofu, or sorry, this tempeh and mushrooms. And I'm turning up the heat here. They've definitely seeped up most of the oil that I tossed in here. I'm gonna add a little bit more oil, because the oil is gonna help bring the temperature up. It's gonna help to sear and crisp up my mixture here. So this will take a little bit, but we'll definitely keep an eye on it. The other thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to just use my hands to break down the tofu here that was still a bit frozen. And any questions as we're waiting for these things to move along? I'm just breaking down. There's just a couple of still like chunks of frozen tofu, but most of it is broken down. And I just want it to be this crumbly tofu. There we go. Frozen hands is a sensation right now. All right, there we go. We have our broken down tofu that'll get coated with half of the chile sauce, chile and spices marinade that we're making right now. And so I like to do these two different steps because the tofu cooks a little bit faster. The tempeh and mushrooms, I really like to get a good crisp on them. And so that's why they're currently cooking while the tofu's still kind of on standby. And I use 2 different pans for a couple different reasons, because you can see that the pan here with the mushrooms and the tempeh is already kind of filled. And so you want to have enough surface space where you have enough of the mixture touching the heat source so that it gets nice and seared. If I were to put the tofu in here, it would just kind of crowd the pan, and I wouldn't really sear the mushrooms and the tempeh and crisp them up. They'd kind of just saute together, which is not what I'm looking for. I want a little bit of crispiness here. And so I'm just going in and making sure that nothing's sticking to the bottom. Then I'm moving things around and trying to cook it evenly. And this just has, again, the salt, mushroom powder, tempeh and mushrooms, a little bit of oil. You can keep adding oil as needed. I'm in a stainless steel pan. If I were using this cast iron, I'd likely use a little bit less of the oil because it's already seasoned with a little bit of oil. But I could add a little bit more to the stainless steel saute pan. For Todo Verde, we use a really big plancha to cook our jackfruit, our chorizo, and a bunch of other ingredients. We even sear our mushrooms for our mushroom mole using a big plancha. So obviously in that case, we have a lot of surface space to crisp up all the different ingredients. So I'm starting to get a little bit of browning happening here, which is nice. And that's what I'm looking for. And you can keep using the back of a spoon or a spatula to keep breaking down any of the tempeh or any big chunks of mushroom. If you use a knife to just hand chop all the mushrooms, you might notice that your texture is a little bit more chunky, which is fine. You can, again, still try to break down the mushrooms a little bit with the back of a spoon. Okay, so I am going to, in the interest of time, go ahead and pull my chiles out of the liquid and blend them up. They've probably been in there for over 5 minutes. And so I just want to get the chile marinade going. So I'm gonna add all my, wow, that's really potent. Makes me wanna cough in a good way. All my chiles go into the blender. And then I'm gonna grab half a cup of water. Let's see if I have a cup measure here. Yeah, half cup. So I'll just go ahead and just scoop up a half cup of water. And toss that in there. And then I'll put the blender lid on. And the water, you might need more depending on the size of your chiles. If they're really big chiles, then you might need to add just a touch more so that it helps the blending process. I'll go ahead and add these to my blender and blend into a paste. So I'm actually gonna add just a touch more water You can see here that I'm starting to get to a paste consistency. It's still pretty thick and I still have chunks of chile that won't break down. And it could also be because I'm using a big Vitamix and all the things that I'm trying to break down are at the bottom. I'll add just about a quarter cup, maybe less than that. Wow, that's strong in a very good way again. There we go. So if you're using a high power blender like I am, then you should be fine to leave this paste as is, which I'll show you the texture of it. Just scrape off this tamper and get every little last bit of that marinade. You can see here this nice paste consistency. It's not runny, it's kind of thick, which is fine because you don't need it to be super runny. And I'm gonna add half of it to this pan that has the mushrooms and tempeh crisping up. And you can see that it's starting to really brown and crisp there. So I'll add half to this and I'll add half to my bowl of tofu and I'll mix that all together and then I'll go ahead and add it to that back skillet there. And then I'll combine the two together after cooking for a few minutes. If you had a really big pan, you can likely do it together if you wanted to, but I just like the crispiness. And just to get half, I like to do like half here, half there, half here, half there. Going back and forth to make sure pretty even. All eventually gonna get combined together, but that way you can sort of start to get the flavors nice and delicious for each batch. And that's the thing with cooking in general, at home, in a commercial kitchen. You want every single element to be super delicious on its own, so that when you bring them together, they are even more delicious. So I got most of that out. Let me get one last little bit here. It will not come out. It's being stubborn. There it goes. And so I got every little last bit, as much as I could out of there. And I have half of it in my saute pan with the mushrooms and the tempeh. Let me go ahead and mix that in. I slightly lowered the heat to like a medium low. I like to cook the mushrooms and tempeh at a slightly higher temperature because mushrooms, if the temperature is just not hot enough, they just release a lot of their liquids, and it just becomes like a saute that doesn't really crisp up. So you need to hit it with enough heat. So there's that mixture so far that I'll continue to cook. I'm just gonna use my spatula here to mix in the chile to my tofu. And once I get everything searing here, I'm gonna start tasting everything a bit more for salt. All right. So I'm just making sure I'm using my spatula to scrape from the outside to the center, making sure that every little last piece is coated. There we go. All right. And then I'm gonna add a little bit of oil here to this cast iron skillet. And I'll go ahead and add my tofu. And I want to spread it out. And so notice how it needs quite a bit of space here to spread out and crisp. All right, and I'm gonna just move this around, making sure that my temperature is okay. It was really hot, I kind of lowered it. I could see that the temperature went down, so I'm bringing it up again. I want to see a little bit of browning here. I have this front stove on a medium-low heat, just cooking the mixture in with the chile sauce and letting that really get nice and bold in its flavors. And the other thing to note here is if you have a home blender and you're blending the cloves, and if you have the whole cinnamon stick, you just want to make sure that it blends all the way smooth. So you could use a mesh strainer to just pass the paste through, just to make sure you don't have any big chunks of clove or anything in there. All right. So as that gets going, I'm going to take out my cheese that I made earlier today. We can start thinking about the cheese for our quesadilla, and we're almost done with our recipe. So this morning I made a queso quesadilla. I should have made it yesterday, but I made it this morning, which is totally fine. And as you can see, it's been in the fridge for a couple hours. It has solidified to this cheese here. Let me get this out of the way. So it's this round of cheese, and it's a little bit gelatinous. The more time it spends in the fridge, if it had another maybe hour in the fridge, it could solidify a little bit more, but this is still gonna slice really well. And so that's because of the agar and the tapioca flour. And I'm going to create slices so that we can make a quesadilla with it. So I'll bring it over to my cutting board, and I'll bring over my knife. Let me give my hand a wash. Y'all do not even want to look at my sink right now. There's quite a few dishes in here, which you won't have as many because you don't have to put all your things in bowls and show others how you portion things out. So it shouldn't be as much of a cleanup project for everybody else. Okay. Let me make sure my tofu is getting a little bit seared up here. Turn up the heat slightly for my back burner for the tofu. And you can see that it broke down really well. So there's no big chunks of tofu. It's all pretty broken down. I'm going to give that just a few more minutes to keep searing, and then I'll combine them together. And I have a knife here that I'm using to go ahead and cut my cheese. So I'm just going to create some slices. And you can see here that the slices, they hold up. So you have here a piece of cheese that holds up. And that's because of the agar, the coconut oil, the tapioca flour, all those things are playing a role in it molding and forming into a cheese. You can see that here. So I'm just gonna cut off a few more slices. And for these longer slices, I'm gonna sear this off. See, it's getting a little softer towards the center. I'm gonna cut that in half. So I have my cheese, it's ready to go for my quesadilla. I'm gonna make one quesadilla for class today. And you can see that let me move my knife over so you can see what it looks like up close. You can see that it has a little bit of air in there. Look at the cheese slices that are holding up fairly well. So this is your queso quesadilla, and you want to sear it. You could just melt it on a tortilla, but I like to sear it directly on the comal because it makes it slightly crispy and gives it a little bit of browning, and so that equals flavor. And so I can see here that my chorizo is just about done. I still have yet to taste for salt. Let me go ahead and do that now. I've been salting along the way, but let me taste for salt now. That mushroom and tempeh is really yummy. That definitely has enough salt. Let's see about our tofu. The tofu could use salt. I'm gonna wait to combine them together. This is a little on the saltier side. I think it'll still need a little bit of salt, but let me go ahead and add my mushrooms and tempeh here to the tofu mixture. We'll just add it over the top. Oh. When some of the spices that hit the bottom of the stove, they burned there because they've been next to the heat source this whole time. Let's see here. Scraping every little last bit out. And so I'll just get rid of this saute pan. And I'm going to bring this one to the front burner for a moment. Let's mix this all together. All right, so you can see here that our chorizo is coming together. It has a nice texture to it. The flavor tastes just like a freshly made chorizo because of the spices in there. The oregano, the chile de árbol, the chile guajillo, the chile ancho, all of it, along with the coriander and the comino, all the different spices. All right, so let me give this another taste. Yeah, I'm gonna add just a touch more salt. And again, chorizo is salty, so you don't want to skimp out on the salt unless there's a reason that you should eat less salt for any dietary reason. But it should have a nice touch of salt.
Jocelyn, can you freeze the leftover chorizo?
Absolutely. Yeah, this freezes really well. You can totally freeze it. I'm going to be sharing this with my family. It's tomorrow's Father's Day, so I'll be seeing some family, and I'm going to be sharing it. But this is good for 4 to 6 people or so. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is the chorizo recipe from the book, which is like if you were just eating tacos de chorizo. But because we're making them in quesadillas today, we're going to be using a bit less. And so you could make, if you're not making it now, you could make half portion, or like that person asked, you could just freeze half of it. So let me get a comal going here. I want to make sure I get a nice coating of oil on this comal so I don't have any sticking. All right. I have a cast iron comal, which I love. I also have a one for work here that is a non-stick, which you can use a non-stick. It'll be obviously a little bit easier. You use a little paper towel to make sure it's spread all over. Even on the handle. That's the good thing about cast iron is like they need all the seasoning So you can always add. All right. So our chorizo is just about there. It's pretty much there. So you can keep cooking it if you wanted to a bit longer. But this is kind of the point where you decide, you know, I like the texture and the flavor now, or I want it to cook a little bit longer and brown a little bit more. And I added that salt, so let me taste for salt again. I just want to taste because I'm hungry. That's the real deal right there. Definitely has a nice amount of salt. And the salt in there makes the flavors pop. It makes all the other spices rise to the forefront of the flavors. Just like a nice accent to this dish, to any dish. All right, so I'm lowering that all the way to low heat. I'm feeling here that my comal is getting pretty hot. And so I'm going to add some cheese and a tortilla that I'm gonna actually grab it now so I have everything ready to go. I'm using here Kernel Truth yellow corn tortilla. It's organic, non-GMO corn. They're based here in Los Angeles. They sell at Sarah's Market in City Terrace, cookbook store in Highland Park, Echo Park, and Grassroots Market in South Pass. So these are really good tortillas. Actually, I should have waited a moment. I'm gonna leave it on the handle. Let me crisp up my cheese. So there's a little bit of sizzling happening that you can see there. All right. So I'm gonna wait until that just slightly crisps up and starts to get a little oozy. Let me grab the spatula again. All right. So I have my spatula here and I'm just on standby. Once I flip these cheeses to the other side, I'm gonna add my tortilla. I'm using here a pre-made tortilla. You can use a handmade tortilla, which would be even more delicious in this recipe, a freshly made tortilla, which is really easy to make. I knew we weren't gonna have enough time to get into that whole process today. And I also took a lot of time prepping and getting everything ready. So if you use a handmade tortilla or pre-made tortilla, it's going to be a little bit faster of a process, which is why I held off to add it to the direct heat course until the cheese gets a little bit more cooked through. And it's already cooked, but I can see here a little bit of browning happening. So let me see if I can flip these here. Let's grab all of them. You can see a little bit of that crispness happening there. It sounded like I said crispiness happening there. I'm gonna go ahead and flip that one. Check out that slight browning there. That's what I'm looking for. That is another layer, dimension of flavor that I'm looking for in this dish. And so now I'm gonna go ahead and add my tortilla. Let me move this over slightly. I went a little overkill on the oil here. You can obviously add less. And I'm going to turn over this tortilla. It's already getting nice and hot. And what I'm gonna do at this point is I'm gonna grab all this bit of, let me grab this handle here, all this cheese and add it to the tortilla. Try to grab all of that crispiness on the bottom. And this is where that non-stick is really good too, or if you're with the plancha, Or if I had even a metal spatula, be able to get that off a little bit easier. I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of my chorizo and fold the quesadilla in half. And I really like this like burnt cheese. I don't know if you've ever had like a chicharrón de queso, which I love. Like this burnt cheese right there, I'm about that life. So good. So this is good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and add it to a plate. Let me lower my heat here. Actually, there we go. You can see here all the crispiness, our chorizo there, our cheese. This is super hot, so I'm gonna give it a moment before I dig in. But any questions as we're wrapping up our class today? Let me move you all back over. I'm gonna bite into this at some point, but it's super hot. So I'll wait just a couple more minutes. And again, I have that chicharrón de queso. See that little hole from the cheese slightly? That's that tapioca flour. Crispy cheese, salty, super delicious. I could eat that all day, just the crispy cheese. And you can top this off if you wanted to make crema, cashew crema from the book. The chorizo recipe has a nice recipe in there for pickled onions, red onions as a garnish. That could be really delicious with this. There's so many a salsa verde de aguacate could be really delicious. There's so many things you can add to it that'll make it even more delicious. So if there are no questions, I'm thinking there are not any questions here, then we can enjoy the rest of our weekends. Hopefully you've enjoyed this class. And I'm gonna just try to see if I can tear this open while I still have you all here. So you can just take a look at that. Ooh, it's hot. Let me get a knife. I'm gonna use my big old knife to just try to cut this. Let me cut it on this cutting board. I just cut it in half. And you can see here, ooh, it's super hot, super crispy, steaming. See how that cheese oozes? So delicious. And obviously, the hotter the cheese, the more oozy it will be. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's class. I hope you all enjoy the recipe. If you have any questions, you can always leave us a comment, send us an email, direct message us via Instagram, and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. We have other classes coming up, so please look out for those. We'll start posting classes for the next month shortly, so look out for that. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. And please be sure to tag us in any photos that you have with either of these recipes or your quesadilla all assembled. Thank you so much. Hopefully I'll see you in a class soon. Take care.